Fuji. The Fuji apple has a genuinely interesting origin story for something you can buy at nearly any supermarket on Earth. It was developed in the 1930s at a research station in Fujisaki, Japan, which is where the name comes from, through a deliberate cross between the Red Delicious and an older, less famous variety called Ralls Janet. It took decades of testing before Fuji apples were released commercially in the 1960s, and it took even longer for them to become the global phenomenon they are today. What makes Fuji stand out is its sheer sweetness combined with a crisp, dense bite. There's very little tartness to speak of, which is part of why it's become such a popular choice for people who want an apple that tastes almost dessert-like straight off the tree. The flesh is notably juicy, and the apple's cellular structure gives it that satisfying crunch that doesn't fade quickly, even after storage. That last point matters more than people usually realize. Fuji apples have an unusually long shelf life compared to many other varieties, partly due to their dense flesh and low respiration rate after harvest. Properly stored, a Fuji can stay crisp and flavorful for months, which is a big part of why grocery stores lean on it so heavily. It doesn't go mealy or soft nearly as fast as more delicate varieties. Today, Fuji is one of the most widely grown apples in the world, with major production in Japan, China, and the United States. Gala. Gala apples trace their roots to New Zealand, where they were first bred in the 1930s from a cross involving the Golden Delicious and a variety called Kids Orange Red. They didn't really take off internationally until decades later, but once they did, they spread fast. And today, Gala is consistently one of the best-selling apples in stores across the world. Part of the appeal is how approachable Gala apples are. They're mildly sweet without being cloying, and the skin is notably thin, which means you get a smooth eating experience without much resistance when you bite in. The flavor is balanced rather than intense, not aggressively tart, not overwhelmingly sweet, which makes Gala something of a crowd pleaser, especially with kids or people who find more assertive apples like Granny Smith too sharp. Texturally, Gala apples are crisp, but not quite as dense as something like a Honeycrisp or Fuji. That slightly softer bite combined with a thin skin makes them popular in salads and lunchboxes where you want something easy to eat without much prep. They also hold up reasonably well when sliced, showing decent resistance to browning compared to some other varieties, which adds to their convenience appeal.
Honeycrisp. Few apples have generated as much buzz in the produce world as Honeycrisp, and there's a fairly specific reason for that: the texture. Honeycrisp apples were developed by researchers at the University of Minnesota with the explicit goal of creating a variety that could survive the brutal cold of Midwestern winters while still producing high-quality fruit. It took roughly 3 decades of breeding and testing before the variety was released to the public in the early 1990s. The signature trait that made Honeycrisp famous is its cell structure. Unlike most apples, where a bite causes the cells to tear along shared walls, Honeycrisp apples tend to have cells that rupture individually. That sounds like a minor technical detail, but it produces a dramatically different sensory experience, an almost explosive, audible crunch that other apples simply don't replicate. Combine that texture with a well-balanced sweet tart flavor, and it's easy to see why Honeycrisp developed such a devoted following so quickly. That popularity comes at a cost. Quite literally, Honeycrisp trees are notoriously difficult and expensive to grow. They're more susceptible to certain diseases, the fruit is prone to bruising, and yields tend to be lower than hardier varieties. All of that gets reflected in the price tag. Honeycrisp is routinely one of the most expensive apples in the produce section, and shoppers generally seem willing to pay for it. Granny Smith. Granny Smith might be the most visually distinctive apple on any produce shelf, thanks to its bright, almost neon green skin. The story behind the name is a nice piece of apple history. It's named after Maria Ann Granny Smith, a settler in Australia who is credited with discovering the variety, reportedly after it sprouted from the remains of discarded French crab apples near a creek on her property in the 1860s. Flavor-wise, Granny Smith sits at the tart end of the spectrum. There's a sharp, almost citrusy acidity to it that sets it apart from the sweeter varieties like Fuji or Gala. Some people love that sharpness on its own. Others find it a bit much for straightforward snacking and prefer it in combination with other ingredients. Where Granny Smith really earns its reputation is in the kitchen. Its firm, dense flesh holds its structure well under heat, which means it doesn't collapse into mush the way softer apples do when baked. That makes it something close to the gold standard for pies, tarts, and crisps, where you want distinct apple slices rather than a uniform sauce-like filling. Bakers also appreciate that its tartness helps balance the added sugar in most dessert recipes, preventing the final product from tasting one-dimensionally sweet.
Red Delicious. Red Delicious has one of the more complicated legacies among apple varieties. For much of the 20th century, it was the single most widely grown apple in the United States, instantly recognizable by its deep, almost almost burgundy red skin and elongated shape with 5 distinct bumps at the base. The apple was actually discovered by accident in Iowa in the 1870s, found growing as a chance seedling on a farm, and it was originally marketed under a different name before eventually becoming delicious. Its striking color and classic apple silhouette made it enormously popular for decades, and it became something of a visual shorthand for Apple in advertising, cartoons, and packaging around the world. That said, Red Delicious has faced real criticism over the years, particularly as growers selectively bred it over time to intensify its red color, sometimes at the expense of flavor and texture. Many people find modern Red Delicious apples to have a somewhat bland, mildly sweet taste and a mealy, soft flesh compared to newer varieties bred with texture as a priority. It's mostly eaten fresh rather than used in cooking, since its soft flesh doesn't hold up particularly well under heat. In recent years, its market dominance has slipped considerably as consumer preferences have shifted towards crisper, more flavorful varieties like Honeycrisp and Gala. Golden Delicious. Despite sharing part of its name with Red Delicious, Golden Delicious is a genetically distinct variety with no close relation to its red counterpart. It was discovered in West Virginia in the early 1900s, found growing on a hillside farm, and was later propagated and marketed based on its appealing golden yellow skin and mellow flavor. Golden Delicious apples have tender flesh and a sweetness that's gentle rather than intense, without much of the sharp tartness found in varieties like Granny Smith. That mildness is actually part of the apple's strength. It doesn't dominate other flavors, which makes it unusually versatile in the kitchen. It works well in applesauce, where its flesh breaks down smoothly, and it holds up reasonably well in baked goods too, retaining some structure while still softening nicely. One thing to note about Golden Delicious is that its thin skin makes it more prone to bruising and shriveling compared to hardier varieties, so it doesn't always have the longest shelf life. Still, its adaptability across so many different uses, fresh eating, baking, sauces, even drying, has kept it a staple variety for generations, even as flashier, newer apples have entered the market.
Pink Lady. Pink Lady is technically a trademarked brand name rather than a variety name in the strictest sense. The actual apple is called Crips Pink, developed in Australia in the 1970s by crossing a Golden Delicious with a Lady Williams apple. The Pink Lady branding was created specifically to market fruit that met certain quality standards, including a minimum level of pink blush coloring and sugar content, which is why not every Crips Pink apple technically qualifies to be sold under the Pink Lady name. Flavor-wise, Pink Lady strikes a genuinely appealing balance between sweetness and tartness, with enough acidity to keep it from tasting flat or one note, paired with a pronounced sweetness that becomes more noticeable as the season progresses. The texture is dense and crisp, and one of its more practical advantages is that it resists going soft or mealy for a long time after purchase, retaining its crunch far longer than many other varieties. Visually, Pink Lady apples are easy to spot thanks to their distinctive pink-red blush layered over a greenish-yellow base, a color pattern that's noticeably different from the more uniform coloring of apples like Fuji or Red Delicious. Between the flavor balance, the extended crispness, and the eye-catching color, Pink Lady has carved out a reputation as something of a premium, specialty apple, often priced accordingly. Braeburn. Braeburn apples originated in New Zealand in the 1950s, discovered as a chance seedling near Nelson, before being cultivated and eventually named after the orchard where it was found. Since then, it's spread to orchards around the world, including significant production in the United States and Europe. The flavor profile of a Braeburn is often described as complex compared to more single-note apples. There's a genuine interplay between sweetness and tartness, sometimes with subtle spiced or aromatic notes that come through, particularly later in the growing season. That complexity has made Braeburn a favorite among people who find apples like Red Delicious a little too simple or one-dimensional. Texturally, Braeburn has notably firm, dense flesh, which gives it an advantage in the kitchen similar to Granny Smith. It holds its shape well during baking, making it a solid choice for pies and crisps, while still being enjoyable eaten fresh thanks to its crisp bite. That dual-purpose reliability, good both raw and cooked, has helped it maintain a steady, loyal following even as the apple market has become more crowded with newer varieties.
McIntosh. McIntosh apples have a genuinely old and storied history. First discovered in Ontario, Canada in 1811 by a farmer named John McIntosh, who found the tree growing wild on his property. He propagated it, and the variety slowly spread from there, eventually becoming one of the most iconic apples in both Canada and the northeastern United States. Its cultural footprint runs deep enough that it's often cited as a partial inspiration for the name of Apple's Macintosh computer line, a nod from a company founder who reportedly enjoyed the fruit. In terms of eating experience, Macintosh has tender, somewhat delicate flesh, with a flavor that leans mildly tart rather than strongly sweet. It's a pleasant apple for fresh eating, but its real strength shows up once heat gets involved. The flesh breaks down quickly and smoothly when cooked, which makes McIntosh one of the best choices for homemade applesauce, and it's also a traditional favorite for cider making, where its juice contributes a bright, slightly tangy character. Because of that soft, quick-to-break-down texture, McIntosh isn't typically the apple of choice for recipes where you want distinct, intact slices, like a classic pie. Instead, it shines in dishes where a smoother, more blended texture is actually the goal. Sauces, purees, and baked desserts where the apple is meant to soften and meld into the rest of the dish rather than hold firm. Cosmic Crisp. Cosmic Crisp is, relatively speaking, the new kid on the block. It's the product of more than 20 years of dedicated breeding research at Washington State University, developed by crossing a Honeycrisp with an enterprise apple, with the explicit goal of combining Honeycrisp's beloved crunch with better storage life and a more manageable growing profile for farmers. After all that development time, it was finally released commercially in 2019, making it one of the newest major apple varieties to hit the mainstream market. The name itself comes from the pattern of pale dots, called lenticels, scattered across the apple's dark red skin, which are said to resemble a starry night sky, hence cosmic. Beyond the name, the eating experience lives up to the hype in several ways. Cosmic Crisp apples are notably firm and crisp, with a juiciness that holds up impressively well in storage, and a flavor that balances sweetness with a moderate tartness. One particularly practical advantage of Cosmic Crisp is its resistance to browning after being cut. Sliced apple that sits out for a while typically starts to turn brown fairly quickly due to oxidation, but Cosmic Crisp is notably slow to develop that discoloration, which makes it a genuinely convenient choice for packed lunches, fruit trays, and any situation where apple slices need to sit around for a bit before being eaten. Combined with its crisp texture and extended shelf stability, it's quickly built a reputation as a strong, all-purpose snacking apple, and production has been expanding steadily since its release.